my name's Jack Thompson. If you'd told me a year ago that, at 62, I'd be plotting revenge instead of enjoying retirement, I'd have thought you'd lost your mind. I had it all figured out: quiet mornings fishing at Eagle Creek, weekend BBQs with my wife, Linda, and working on that old cabin we bought years back in the Blue Ridge Mountains. 45 years of marriage, 2 grown kids, a life built in Maplewood, Ohio. We had a good thing going. Or so I thought. It started with the small stuff, the kind of things you brush off until you can't. Linda became distant. She'd stay out late, claiming she had charity work in Cincinnati. She'd come home in new clothes, her hair smelling of a perfume that didn't match the scent I'd known for decades. I wanted to ignore it. Told myself I was being paranoid. But then came the late-night phone calls, the whispers in the hallway. You don't get to be married that long without knowing when something's wrong. Then, one night, I came home early and everything fell apart. I had this stupid, hopeful idea about surprising her. Picked up her favorite chocolate cream pie from Johnson's Bakery on Elm Street. But as I turned onto our street, I noticed it, a sleek, black Porsche parked right in front of the house. Shiny and new, like a peacock strutting in our blue-collar neighborhood. My stomach twisted into a knot so tight it hurt. The front door was cracked open. I stepped inside, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. Then I heard it, a deep, rumbling laugh, followed by a light, familiar giggle. Linda's giggle. The one I hadn't heard in years. I moved quietly, inching closer to the living room, not sure if I wanted to see what was happening but too angry to walk away. I stopped in my tracks. Linda was there, on the couch. Her blouse was unbuttoned, her hair wild, and she was practically glowing, smiling like a teenager. Beside her, a man I'd never seen before sat way too close. He was tall, with dark skin and a perfectly tailored suit that looked like it cost more than our whole house. His hand rested on her thigh, and she didn't seem to mind. Hell, she looked like she was enjoying it. My world cracked apart. Linda noticed me first. She scrambled off the couch, trying to fix her blouse, her face pale and eyes wide. "Jack," she stammered, tears already forming. But the man didn't even flinch. He turned to me, calm as anything, with this smug smile that made me want to break something. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice cool, almost amused. I swallowed hard, my fists clenching at my sides. "Get out," I said, my voice shaking, barely under control. Linda reached for me, her hands trembling. "Jack, wait, I can explain," she started, but I couldn't look at her. My eyes were locked on him. The man who had the audacity to walk into my home, into my marriage. He stood up slowly, that same smirk still plastered on his face, like he was untouchable. Big mistake. Before I could stop myself, I lunged. I grabbed his expensive suit, slamming him against the wall. His eyes widened, but only for a second. My hands were shaking, not just from the adrenaline but from the rage burning through me. For a moment, I wanted to do more. Wanted to hurt him. But I forced myself to let go, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He straightened his jacket, that damn smirk not quite gone. "You going to regret that," he said, voice low, almost a whisper. I didn't respond. Couldn't. I was too broken, too stunned. He walked out, leaving the door swinging open. Linda collapsed onto the floor, sobbing, but I couldn't comfort her. Not this time. Not ever again. My wife. My partner of 45 years. Everything was a lie. I stood there, feeling a dark, heavy anger settle in my chest. This wasn't something I could just walk away from. Not anymore. And as I looked at Linda, clutching her blouse and crying, I knew one thing for certain: I was done playing the fool. After that night, nothing felt real anymore. The whole house seemed different, as if Linda's betrayal had soaked into the walls, tainting everything we'd built together. I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, staring at the chocolate cream pie I'd bought. It sat there untouched, mocking me with its sweetness. Linda had gone upstairs hours ago. I'd heard her crying, pacing back and forth, but I didn't follow her. I didn't want to hear whatever excuse she'd prepared. I was done listening to lies. 45 years of marriage, and it had come to this, a broken man, sitting in his own kitchen, wondering where it had all gone wrong. By morning, I knew one thing, just walking away wasn't an option. The thought of packing up and starting over at my age felt like defeat, and I wasn't ready to lose everything. Not without a fight. That day, Linda tiptoed around me, eyes red and puffy, her voice hushed. She tried to make small talk, offered to make breakfast, but I just stared at her. The woman I'd once loved, trusted with every piece of myself, now felt like a stranger in my own home. Her presence made my skin crawl. I needed answers, and I needed a plan. After she left the house, probably to meet him, I drove to the hardware store. My hands still shook, but I knew what I had to do. I picked up a GPS tracker, the kind that sticks under a car. It wasn't hard to find. These days, you can get anything if you know where to look. As I paid for it, I felt a grim sense of purpose settling over me. If she thought she could hide things from me, she was wrong. That evening, while she was in the shower, I slipped outside and attached the tracker under her car. The whole time, my heart pounded like a drum, but I pushed through it. I couldn't afford to be scared anymore. I needed to know where she went, who she saw, and what lies she was living behind my back. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, replaying every strange behavior, every late night, every whispered phone call. Pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve were coming together. And in the middle of that storm of thoughts, an idea began to form. Something darker than anything I'd ever imagined. I wouldn't be the fool who let his life crumble without a fight. No. If Linda wanted to ruin everything we'd built together, she was going to face the consequences. Her and that smug bastard she'd chosen over me. By the next morning, I'd made up my mind. I was done being a victim. It was time to take back control, no matter what it took. I didn't have to wait long for the tracker to pay off. The next day, I sat in my truck in a Walmart parking lot, phone in hand, watching Linda's little dot move across the screen. She was supposed to be at her volunteer work in Cincinnati, but I had a feeling she was going somewhere far less innocent. My gut twisted as I saw her dot stop in a part of town I'd never been to. A place on the edge of the city, where the streetlights were few and far between, and the buildings looked like they'd seen better days decades ago. An industrial area, half abandoned, known for shady dealings. I clenched the steering wheel, debating if I should follow. What would I even do if I caught her again, this time in some rundown part of town, wrapped up in God knows what? But I needed to know. Needed to see how deep this betrayal went. So, I turned the ignition and headed that way, each mile making the dread in my chest heavier. When I got there, I parked a block away and watched. Her car was right in front of a grey warehouse, the kind with windows that were either boarded up or shuttered. My hands shook as I gripped the binoculars I'd borrowed from a friend who loved birdwatching. I never imagined I'd be using them for something like this. The warehouse had a big garage door, open just enough for a car to slip through. Linda's car was parked out front, and I saw her get out. She looked different, nervous, fidgety. She kept glancing around, clutching her purse tightly. My stomach sank further when I saw a man step out of the shadows. Not her lover, but someone else. He was dressed casually, but there was something about him, something dangerous. Tattoos snaked up his neck, and he had a rough, hardened look. They exchanged words I couldn't hear, and then she handed him an envelope. He counted the cash inside, then pulled a small, unmarked baggie from his jacket and gave it to her. My mouth went dry. Drugs. She was buying drugs. The kind of thing you see in crime dramas, not something you expect to watch your wife do. She took the baggie, shoved it into her purse, and glanced around again, like a guilty teenager. Then, as if she couldn't get out of there fast enough, she hurried back to her car and sped off. I stayed parked, my brain spinning. This wasn't just a midlife crisis or an affair. Linda had fallen into something darker, something that could destroy us both if I didn't act. And her lover, Damon, the smug bastard, must have been the one to drag her into this. I gritted my teeth, feeling the anger boiling up again. It wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about survival. I followed her home, keeping my distance. She didn't know I was onto her, and that was my only advantage. Back in our house, she was all smiles, like nothing was wrong, but I couldn't shake the image of her in that dirty, industrial part of town, making deals with men who looked like they belonged in a prison lineup. That night, as she cooked dinner, I sat in the living room, watching her like a stranger. My mind was racing, connecting the dots. The way she'd been losing weight, the anxious energy, the sleepless nights. It all made sense now. I had to find a way to use this information, to turn the tables. She and Damon thought they had the upper hand, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. If she wanted to drag our life into the dirt, I'd be the one to bury them both. The next step in my plan required patience and precision. It wasn't enough to know where Linda was going or who she was meeting. I needed to strike back, to make them feel the humiliation and fear that I had felt. That meant I had to get creative. I watched her for days, studying her patterns. When she wasn't faking smiles at home, she was running off to that warehouse or meeting her lover, Damon. One evening, after she came back, I noticed her stumbling into the bathroom, looking dazed. She hadn't seen me watching, but I followed her quietly. In the bathroom, she pulled out a small, hidden stash of those drugs she'd bought. My heart raced as I realized this was my chance. The next morning, when she left to volunteer again, I acted quickly. I went into the bathroom, found her stash, and carefully poured the powder out, replacing it with finely sifted flour. I made sure it looked identical. When I was done, I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. My hands were shaking, but a grim smile crept onto my face. Let them think they were getting high. It was going to be quite the surprise. But I didn't stop there. I needed to see their reaction. That's when I set up my drone. It was a high-tech model I'd bought for fun a few years back, and it had a camera that could film in crisp HD. I charged it, made sure everything was working perfectly, and waited. That afternoon, the GPS tracker showed Linda's car heading to Damon's place, a mansion on the outskirts of the city. I parked my truck in a discreet spot and launched the drone, following her from a distance. The screen on my tablet showed every detail: Linda stepping out of her car, her nervous smile, Damon greeting her at the door like he hadn't a care in the world. I clenched my jaw, watching as they made their way into the house. The drone hovered outside the large windows, its silent camera capturing everything. Damon pulled Linda close, and I felt a pang of disgust as he kissed her. They moved toward the living room, shedding clothes as they went, and I forced myself to keep watching. Linda lay back on the expensive leather couch, her blouse slipping off her shoulders. Damon leaned over her, whispering things I was glad I couldn't hear. My stomach churned, but I needed to see this through. After their little performance, they finally turned to the drugs, or what they thought were drugs. Damon opened the baggie, his eyes lighting up like a kid on Christmas morning. He prepared a line for both of them, and Linda watched eagerly, her pupils dilated, anticipation written all over her face. My hands tightened around the controls of the drone, and I held my breath. Then they snorted the flour. The confusion on Damon's face was priceless. He sniffed again, a look of disbelief crossing his features. Linda did the same, coughing as the powder tickled her nose. "What the hell?" Damon muttered, wiping his nose, realization dawning on him. Linda's face twisted in confusion, and then in horror. I couldn't help it. I laughed, a dark, bitter sound. I had them. On video. Their humiliation, their stupidity, it was all mine to use. But this was just the beginning. I thought I was prepared for anything. After replacing the drugs with flour and capturing Linda and Damon's humiliation on video, I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. Watching them sniff baking powder and then look at each other in disbelief had been priceless. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. My mind kept turning, restless, as I planned my next move. It had to be bigger, more permanent. Something that would truly destroy the life she thought she could build on lies. It was late that night, well past midnight, when Linda finally went to bed. She'd been jittery all evening, trying to make conversation, but I wasn't in the mood. Her nervous energy only made me more suspicious. When I heard her snoring softly, I knew it was time to dig deeper. Her phone was charging in the living room. I slipped it out of the charger, careful not to make a sound, and sat down at the dining table. My heart pounded as I scrolled through her messages, her photos, her emails. But it was when I opened the folder labeled bills and receipts that my world shattered all over again. It wasn't bills. It wasn't receipts. It was a collection of photos, hundreds of them. My hand trembled as I opened the first image. Linda, laughing, her arms wrapped around a stranger, then another, and another. Different men, different places. She looked happy. Ecstatic, even. There were videos too, ones I couldn't bring myself to watch, but I got the idea. I was sick to my stomach. This wasn't just one affair. This had been going on for years. There must have been at least 10 different men, maybe more. My wife had been living a double life, and I'd been too blind to see it. My hand tightened around the phone. Rage and disgust flooded through me. 45 years. 45 goddamn years, and this was the truth. She wasn't the woman I thought she was. She never had been. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something on the bookshelf. A small, inconspicuous flash drive tucked behind a row of old photo albums. My gut told me it wasn't there by accident. I reached for it, plugging it into my laptop. The files on the drive were even worse. A secret collection, videos of encounters she'd recorded, apparently to relive her adventures. My jaw clenched, and I slammed the laptop shut. My entire body shook with rage. The woman I had devoted my life to had been living a fantasy, a life of secrets and betrayals. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. This changed everything. If she thought she'd just been caught having a fling, she was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't about one man or one mistake. This was about a lifetime of lies. And I was done playing the fool. A dark idea formed in my mind, and I knew exactly what I had to do. It was time to show her what it felt like to lose everything. To watch your world burn. I stood up, a grim smile forming. I was going to make her regret every lie, every betrayal. But first, I had to prepare. The next phase of my revenge would be brutal, and I was ready to take it all the way. Finding out about Linda's decades of betrayal had flipped a switch in me. I couldn't sit still, couldn't stop the flood of memories from overtaking me. Every anniversary we'd celebrated, every quiet evening on the porch, every smile I thought was genuine, all of it felt like a cruel joke. How long had she been lying to me, pretending we had something real while she chased her secret thrills? The next morning, Linda tried to act normal. She poured coffee, asked if I wanted pancakes, but her voice was strained. The tension between us was like a knife, ready to cut through the thin veil of civility we'd been holding onto. I grunted a response and left the kitchen, barely able to look at her. Little did she know what I'd discovered the night before. I spent the day preparing. My mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in years. The anger that had once blinded me now gave me focus. I reviewed the footage from the drone, the humiliating scene of Linda and Damon snorting flour, the confusion and embarrassment that followed. It was good leverage, but it wasn't enough. They needed to be broken, not just embarrassed. That afternoon, I gathered every piece of evidence I had, the photos, the videos, the drone footage. I organized it on my computer, creating a folder I labeled Final Judgment. I wasn't sure who'd see it yet, maybe the police, maybe her friends, maybe even our children. But one thing was certain, I would make sure she never escaped the consequences of her actions. Then, I went a step further. I pulled out a burner phone I'd bought earlier that week and made a call to a man named Ray. Ray was an old contact from back in my days working in construction, a guy who had connections, people who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. We hadn't spoken in years, but he owed me a favor. "Ray," I said when he picked up, my voice steady. "I need something taken care of." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You've got my attention." "What's the job?" I laid it out, careful with my words. I didn't need anyone killed, but I wanted damage, something that would ruin Damon's empire, make him pay. Ray listened, and when I finished, he said, "Consider it done." I hung up, feeling a grim satisfaction. The wheels were in motion. That evening, I watched Linda get ready. She was wearing that red dress, the one that used to take my breath away. Now, it only made me feel sick. She checked her reflection, touching up her lipstick, and for a moment, she looked nervous, like she knew something was off. "I'll be back late," she said, grabbing her purse. Her eyes met mine, searching for some sign of forgiveness, some crack in my armor. But she found nothing. "Take your time," I replied coldly. As soon as she left, I waited a few minutes and then followed her, drone and phone ready. The GPS led me to a luxury hotel on the edge of town. I parked nearby, my heart pounding but steady. I sent the drone up, watching on my tablet as she met Damon in the hotel bar. They laughed, flirted, acting like two teenagers without a care in the world. My fingers tightened around the tablet. This time, I wasn't just watching. I was documenting everything, preparing for the final blow. But just when I thought I couldn't feel any angrier, Damon leaned in and whispered something in her ear. She giggled, and they moved upstairs. My stomach twisted as I imagined what would come next. But this time, I had all the evidence I needed. When it was over, and they both lay ruined in the ashes of their lies, I'd be the one standing tall. I sat in my truck, eyes fixed on the hotel, and waited. The time for reckoning was almost here. The next morning, the calm before the storm was almost eerie. Linda acted like everything was normal, but there was a nervous energy about her. She made small talk, pretending that everything between us hadn't been shattered. I barely acknowledged her, focusing instead on what needed to be done. After she left for work, I got into my truck and drove to meet Ray. He was waiting for me in the parking lot of a greasy diner off Route 27, looking exactly as I remembered, rough around the edges, with a face that had seen more trouble than most men could handle. We didn't bother with small talk. "What do you need trashed?" Ray asked, leaning against his battered old pickup. His eyes were cold, calculating. "Damon King," I replied, my voice steady. "I want his business burned to the ground. Figuratively, if possible. Literally, if necessary." Ray raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Heard of him. Runs some shady deals. You sure you want to go this far?" I met his gaze, and for the first time in days, I felt completely sure. "I'm sure." Ray's smile was more of a smirk. "Consider it done. His people won't know what hit them." I nodded, handed him a thick envelope of cash, and drove away, my pulse steady and calm. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. Damon was about to lose everything, and he had no idea it was coming. Back home, I set up everything I needed. I went through the files on my computer one last time, perfecting the video compilation that showed Linda and Damon at their worst. Every laugh, every kiss, every time they snorted that flower, thinking it was something stronger. I combined it with the evidence of Linda's decades of affairs, making sure that when this went public, there would be no recovering from it. Then came the final piece. I wrote a letter, a last goodbye of sorts, explaining the truth to our children. Not to hurt them, but to make sure they knew who their mother really was. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but they deserved the truth. As evening approached, I waited. Linda was getting ready for another night out. She had no idea what I was planning. This time, though, I wasn't following her. This time, I was laying a trap she'd never see coming. When she left, I took my drone and set it to record again. Ray had promised me a show, and I intended to capture every second. Damon's empire would crumble, and I'd have the proof. My fingers itched with anticipation, knowing that soon, everything would fall into place. The evening dragged on, heavy and suffocating. The kind of night where the tension wraps around you, making every minute feel longer than it should. I sat in my old truck a few blocks away from Damon's shiny office building, drumming my fingers against the steering wheel, waiting for the call. His place looked like a monument to wealth and power, all that glass and steel gleaming in the dim city lights. But tonight, all that money wouldn't mean a damn thing. I'd found a parking spot under a big oak tree, branches throwing shadows that danced across my windshield. The phone rested on the dashboard, and every time it buzzed, my heart jumped into my throat. Finally, it vibrated, and I grabbed it, hands sweating. "We're in place," came Ray's gravelly voice, as calm as ever. He was the kind of man who'd seen too much to ever get rattled. "You ready to light it up?" he asked, a hint of a grin in his tone. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and forced myself to breathe out slowly. "Do it," I said, voice steady, even though my whole body felt like a coiled spring. Ray didn't need to hear it twice. I launched my drone, watching on the tablet as it soared above rooftops, circling until I had a perfect view of Damon's fortress. The camera feed was sharp, showing Ray's guys moving like shadows. They crept along the edges of the building, heavy cans of gasoline in hand, setting up the sequence of small but effective explosions. Just enough to send a message, but not enough to hurt anyone. I wasn't a killer. I reminded myself of that as the first small pop echoed through the night. Flames licked up the side of the building, devouring everything they touched. Smoke billowed out, thick and black, rising against the dark sky. Sirens screamed in the distance, and red and blue lights flashed, painting the chaos. My grip on the tablet tightened as I watched Damon's empire start to unravel, piece by piece. Leaning back, I tried to steady my breathing. Adrenaline pumped through me, but there was no satisfaction. Not yet. This was only one part of the plan. My hands still shook, but now it was from anticipation, not fear. The night was far from over. Then, my phone buzzed again. I snatched it up, thinking Ray had more news, but it was Linda's name on the screen. My gut twisted. I waited a beat before answering. "Jack," she said, voice shaky, like she'd been running or crying. "Have you seen the news? Something happened at Damon's office." I made my voice sound confused, casual. "What are you talking about?" There's a fire," she said, her voice cracking. "They are saying it's arson." God, what is happening? It took everything in me not to laugh at her panic. "I'm sure it'll be fine," I said, keeping my tone calm, almost uninterested. "Maybe you should come home. No sense in getting mixed up in that." A pause. I imagined her standing there, clutching her purse, eyes wide with fear. "Okay," she whispered, sounding like she was holding back tears. That fear in her voice felt like a small victory. She was starting to realize she wasn't in control anymore. When I hung up, I turned my attention back to the drone footage. Firefighters were on the scene now, battling the flames, but the damage was done. Damon's perfect little world was up in smoke. I should have felt triumphant, but I wasn't done yet. I had something more personal planned. It had taken me hours to compile all the evidence, video clips of Linda and Damon, the recordings of their little drug routine with the flour I swapped in, and the photos I'd found of Linda's years of secret affairs. All of it was ready, waiting for the final blow. I composed an anonymous email, untraceable, and attached the damning video. The subject line, the woman you trust. I typed a short message, she's not who you think she is. Then, with a deep breath, I hit send. I didn't know exactly how Damon would react, but I could imagine. And I wanted them to turn on each other, to see their trust shatter like mine had. My phone buzzed again, news alerts flashing about the fire, rumors swirling about arson, financial ruin, and legal consequences. Damon's empire was crumbling, and I had the front row seat. But there was one last act. Linda would be home soon. She'd think she could explain that there was some way to fix this mess. But she was wrong. This time, I'd be the one in control, and there'd be no more lies, no more games. As the last light of day faded and darkness settled over the city, I readied myself. The endgame was here, and I was going to make sure it hit hard. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked away, each second feeling like a drumbeat in my chest. The whole house felt off, colder somehow, even though everything was the same as it had always been. I sat at the old wooden table, laptop open in front of me, with a folder titled Final Judgment staring back at me like a loaded gun. My hands weren't shaking anymore. Instead, there was this eerie calm that settled over me, the kind that comes right before a storm. Outside, the last traces of daylight had disappeared, leaving shadows stretching long and deep across the room. The only light came from the dim glow of my laptop screen. The rest of the house was dark, and that felt fitting somehow. A place that used to feel warm, now stripped bare of anything good. I checked my phone again, watching the little GPS dot that marked Linda's car. It moved slowly, winding through the streets, coming closer. She'd be home any minute, and this time, there was no more hiding. No more pretending. I thought about everything I'd uncovered in the past few days. The photos, the videos, the hidden life she'd lived right under my nose. It wasn't just one affair or one moment of weakness. It was years of lies, a web so tangled I wasn't sure how I'd missed it. Damon was only the latest in a long list of men. Men she'd snuck around with while I sat at home, trusting her, loving her. My jaw tightened as I remembered the images, Linda laughing, looking happier with strangers than she'd ever looked with me in recent years. It hurt, deeper than I thought possible. But I wasn't here to wallow in the pain. I was here to end it, to confront the betrayal head-on. The crunch of gravel in the driveway snapped me out of my thoughts. Her car door slammed shut, and then came the familiar jingle of her keys. My whole body went tense, every muscle coiled and ready. She paused at the front door, and I wondered if she could feel the shift in the air, the heavy sense of something coming. The door creaked open, and there she was. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, makeup smudged from what looked like hours of stress and crying. Her gaze searched the dimly lit kitchen, landing on me. "Jack," she said, voice cracking. Something happened. Damon's office? I didn't let her finish. My voice came out cold, steady. "I know," I said. "I saw." She blinked, confusion flashing across her face. She set her purse down on the counter, hands trembling. You saw," she echoed, like she was trying to process what that meant. "Everything," I replied, and the word hung in the air like a sharp blade. I gestured to the laptop. "I know about you and Damon. And not just him. All the others, too." Her face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she couldn't quite form the words. "What?" she whispered, barely audible. I stood up slowly, my anger simmering just under the surface. "How many years, Linda?" I asked, my voice hard. "How long have you been lying to me? Was any of this real, or was it all just a game to you?" She stumbled back a step, eyes wide. "Jack, please," she started, her voice shaking. "I can explain?" A laugh bubbled up out of me, harsh and bitter, like I couldn't believe the absurdity of it. "Explain?" I said, cutting her off. "Explain how you spent years sneaking around, screwing other men while I trusted you? While I loved you?" Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over as she reached for me. Her hands trembled. "It didn't mean anything," she choked out, her voice cracking with desperation. "You have to believe me. It was never about love." I pulled back, revulsion twisting in my gut. "Nothing?" I repeated, disbelief coloring my words. "You destroyed us, and you think that makes it better? That it didn't mean anything?" Her sobs came harder, her shoulders shaking. "Please," she begged. "We can fix this. We can try." I walked over to the laptop, clicking on the video I'd prepared. The one of her and Damon, their laughter, the way they flirted, thinking they were untouchable. The room filled with their voices, their betrayal echoing off the walls. Linda crumpled to the floor, covering her face. "Turn it off," she pleaded, voice breaking. I can't watch this." I let the video play for a few more seconds, each moment stabbing deeper into whatever remained of my heart. Then, finally, I paused it. "You did this," I said, my voice cracking. "You chose this. And now you want me to just forget it? To pretend none of it happened?" She looked up at me, eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely holding herself together. "I was stupid, I was lost." I stepped back, feeling the last shred of hope I'd had for us wither away. "Get out," I said, my voice flat and unyielding. "I don't care where you go, but you can't stay here." Linda's eyes widened, panic flooding her expression. "Jack, please. We've been together so long. You can't just—" "Yes, I can," I interrupted, my jaw clenched tight. "I'll be filing for divorce tomorrow. We're done. You've taken everything from me, and I won't let you keep taking." For a moment, she didn't move, like she couldn't believe this was happening. Then, slowly, she stood, her legs shaky. She stumbled toward the door, her sobs echoing through the quiet house. The sound felt hollow, empty, like everything she'd ever promised me. When the door finally closed behind her, I sank into the nearest chair, my body shaking. The silence of the house settled over me, but it felt less suffocating now. Like a weight had been lifted, even if the pain was still raw. I sat there for a while, breathing in the emptiness. This was it, the end of us. But it wasn't the end of everything. Damon still had to pay, and I had plans for him too. Plans that would make sure he'd never forget the day he crossed me. The storm wasn't over yet, and I was ready to see it through. The silence in the house felt deafening, a heavy, oppressive thing that seemed to press down on me. Even though Linda had left, the echoes of her sobbing still hung in the air, like ghosts that wouldn't leave. I sat there, unmoving, in the cold grip of everything that had just gone down. It was strange to feel so empty and yet so full of raw, burning energy. My hands were steady, but my heart raced like I'd just run a marathon. I knew one thing, I wasn't done. Linda might be gone, but Damon was still out there. That smug, arrogant bastard thought he could have whatever he wanted without consequences. He was the one who'd pushed everything over the edge, the one who'd made himself a key player in the wreckage of my life. And tonight, I was going to make sure he learned a lesson he'd never forget. Standing up from the kitchen chair, I felt every bone in my body creak in protest, but I pushed through it. I grabbed the burner phone from my pocket and dialed Ray's number. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice as rough as sandpaper but as steady as a rock. "You really don't rest, do you?" Ray said, almost amused. "What now?" I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep my voice even. "There's one last thing," I told him. "It's Damon King." I want him ruined, and I mean ruined. Ray let out a low whistle. You serious about this, huh? All right, tell me what you're thinking. I laid it out, my words measured and careful. I didn't need Damon dead, but I needed him broken. His entire empire was built on a foundation of dirty money, crooked deals, and lies, and it was time to pull the rug out from under him. Ray listened, not interrupting, and when I finished, he exhaled a slow breath. Consider it done, he said. Guy like him? He'll never see it coming. I hung up, my mind buzzing. There was no turning back, but I'd made my peace with that. This wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake. It was about balance, about making sure the people who tore my life apart didn't walk away without a scratch. I got into my truck and drove to the edge of town, where Damon's mansion loomed like a castle, complete with iron gates and security cameras. The place was a monument to his arrogance, but tonight, that arrogance was going to cost him. Parking a good distance away, I launched the drone again, watching the camera feed on my phone. Damon was on his patio, lounging with a glass of something expensive, completely unaware that his whole world was about to implode. My phone buzzed with a message from Ray, and we're all set. Watch and enjoy. And then, it started. First, Damon's phone rang, and I could see his relaxed expression turn to confusion, then shock. He stood up so fast he almost knocked over his drink, yelling into the phone, his face turning red with panic. The man who always seemed to have control over everything suddenly looked small and scared. It didn't stop there. Red and blue lights flashed at the gates as police vehicles pulled up, sirens blaring. Damon's empire, the one he'd built on lies, was crumbling in real time. My drone captured every moment, and I watched as officers approached his door, warrants in hand. Damon was yelling, gesturing wildly, but there was nothing he could do to stop it. I sat there in my truck, my grip on the steering wheel loosening for the first time in what felt like forever. Watching him lose everything didn't bring joy, exactly, but there was a dark satisfaction, a sense that the scales of justice were finally tipping in my favor. Damon and Linda had torn my life apart, but they weren't getting away with it. Once the chaos reached its peak, I guided the drone back, packed it up, and started the drive home. The streets were quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy but oddly calming. When I walked into the house, it was still cold, but maybe a little less empty. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking. I sat back down at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. The memories of what my life used to be washed over me, the good mixed in with the bitter. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, the burn a welcome distraction from the ache in my chest. The folder labeled Final Judgment was still open on my laptop, a reminder of everything I'd done. Maybe one day I'd close it, erase it, move on. But not tonight. I sipped the whiskey, feeling the warmth spread through me, and wondered what came next. Starting over wasn't going to be easy. Trusting again? Even harder. But I was still here, still standing. And maybe that was enough for now.